and I guided everybody through a journey to meet the ancestors. And it took maybe 45 minutes. And right in the middle of that 45 minutes, everything went really quiet. We couldn't hear anything that was happening outside anymore, even though there were crazy winds and there was lots of shouting and, you can imagine like fires coming to the boundary of the property.
My guest today is educator and consultant involved in research and activism, the founder of Eco-Influency. Her work lives at the meeting point of science, intuition, ecology, and the ancient human capacity to listen. She explores communication with nature not as a metaphor, but as a way of entering into dialogue with the living world around us. Through her work, she helps people remember that is not just a silent background for us human, but a living presence, a partner, and perhaps even a voice that can be influenced in the decision shaping our future. It is a great joy to welcome Saskia von Diest to Whispers of the Soul. Welcome, Saskia.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak about ecofluency.
Saskia, uh, on your presentation, on one of your presentation, you said that the well-being of the earth depends on our presence, not our absence. Could you share with us and tell to us what do you mean by this?
Absolutely. Thank you. I say that because what I've learned through nature communication is that the earth doesn't experience it as though there are too many of us.
Mhm.
There is actually more than enough for all of our need, but not for our greed.
Mhm.
And even though some might say that nature doesn't need us, we often forget that we are nature itself.
Mhm.
And what has been shown and what I share in the talk that you refer to, which is the keynote speech that I gave for the Global Health Summit, which was organized by the Wellbeing Project, and that was held in Ljubljana in Slovenia last year around this time, um, is that through our presence, not just through our physical presence in ecosystem restoration and landscape regeneration, but through ritual and ceremony, we can actually reclaim our role as a hyperkeystone species in a beneficial way so that we are looking after ecosystems not just on their physical level with biodiversity, but through the vitality of the metaphysical, of the more than human aspects that are invisible to us, which make up so much of the ecosystem beyond what we can physically see with our eyes. And in doing so, we actually can create these very biodiverse ecosystems that look pristine, like what Dr. Lila June Johnston, who did her PhD at University of Alaska, I believe, and she found through her work in First Nations practices of ecosystems all across North, Central, and South America that these ecosystems weren't present and thriving despite humans, but because of humans. So
Mhm.
anybody who would like to can have a look at the talk, and I detail it based on the research that the Amazon rainforest didn't exist without the intervention of humans. So that's what I really mean by it, is that yes, if we leave a space to be rewilded, then it will recover.
Mhm.
But since we've done so much damage, it's also up to us to cause um, cause the healing to take place. And we cannot just catalyze that, but accelerate that. And it
Mhm.
means that we need to be bringing our full human presence, these physical bodies that can sing and can dance and can pick up and move things because we have opposable thumbs, and can use our voices and can use our capacity to communicate with the more than humans through nature communication. So we use our wider range of senses and awareness to dialogue with every aspect of the rest of nature. And I specifically say the rest of nature because We are nature itself. So we are nature healing itself. We are nature experiencing itself through these bodies, these instruments of listening. And that's part of what I mean by it. But it means that in order to reclaim our full presence and our role as a keystone species in a beneficial way, a hyper-keystone species, because we already are that, but not necessarily in a beneficial way. So to do that in a way that is positive for the rest of nature, it means that we need to know how to listen to what is needed and to ask the right questions, and then to listen again, and then to listen some more, and then to respond in a way that is not just intellectual, but activates all of ourself, our imagination and our inspiration and our intuition and our dreams and our everything, bringing all of ourselves, because we're not just our minds, not just our logic and our intellect. There's so much more to us, and there's a magic to us that we can bring, which is really what the earth needs.
You feel that people sometimes approach communication with nature as some kind of technique they can learn instead of as a relationship to enter.
Absolutely. And of course it is a technique to be learned, but it is also paradoxical in that it is as much about unlearning what we already thought that we knew, as much as it is about learning something new. These techniques and these skills, these capacities that have been dormant and forgotten by many of us. So it is a skill, it's a relationship skill. In the same way that we have tools for relating with other humans, we can have these tools that relate with the more than human. And actually, it ends up helping our relationships with humans just as well, because we are nature and we carry over so many of the patterns and dynamics that we have in our human relationships to the more than human as well. So this becomes a path of personal development, and it becomes a way of shifting our worldview in a very experiential way. And I have had that myself, having come from a background where I was very proudly scientist and very proudly sort of reductionist materialist, like if you can see it, you can believe it. And then it turns out like, actually, no, there's so much that we can't see, and yet it's still real. And yeah, so nature communication is a skill, but I also like the fact that you talk about it as a way of a deeper way of knowing, as a way of relating, because really that's what it is. It helps us remember right relationship with the rest of life on Earth and also with ourselves. This is a way of navigating inner ecology as well as outer ecology. So yeah, it is a tool for relating, absolutely.
Yeah. You were talking about communicating with the nature. Could you give us some example? Because I know you have many experience in helping the land. So not talking only about theoretically that, yes, we have to have the relationship with nature, but can you share some stories? Because I know you have beautiful stories where it actually helped the nature itself.
Yeah, there are quite a few examples. The one that pops to mind actually is in a recent in a recent retreat that I ran. Actually, it was already last year, October last year, so it's a while back. I keep thinking it's recent, but it's not. So in October last year, I was teaching a retreat, and that was at a gorgeous retreat center called Bodhikaya here in South Africa. And at Bodhikaya, it's in an area that surrounds the nearest town, big town, would be Gansbaai and Stanford. Those are the two towns. And there were these massive raging wildfires that were happening there. And I was concerned that they would affect the retreat because the fires were affecting thousands of hectares already. And then in the middle of the retreat, the fire came to the edge of the property of the wider land, because Bodhikaya is on a fairly large piece of land, and it started coming to the boundary fence and the road, which is on one of the boundaries. So we had to start preparing to evacuate in the middle of the retreat, and I thought, okay, this is going to be cut short. So I packed all my stuff up and put it in the car, But then rather than just sitting and freaking out, I asked the land what is needed. And what I got was that I needed to go to a place where there's a labyrinth that had been built, and I had to take um, a vulture feather with me. And I happened to have packed a vulture feather with me, which I don't normally do. It's not one of the ceremonial items I typically use. And I didn't know at the time that there used to be, or maybe still are now after rehabilitation, that there are some Cape vultures in the area. So it's not a place, this was a vulture feather that I'd gotten from further up country in Kruger National Park, but actually there are vultures in the Western Cape area. Anyway, so I went to this labyrinth, and I walked it and went to the center and sat and asked the ancestors of the land what was needed. And the first thing they said was, "Thank you for bringing the gift of the vulture feather. You heard us." So I put it in the soil there, right in the center. And then I got the message that what was needed was for everybody to be listening, as many people as possible to be listening to the ancestors of the landscape. And I was like, well, how am I going to do that? Like, not only was my retreat happening, but there was a bunch of other people who were there on solo retreat as well. And a lot of the staff were running around. I mean, the staff were freaked out as well, because this is the worst fire that they had seen in, as far as I could tell, the history of that retreat center being there, and it had been around for a long time. So I decided, okay, I'm going to walk back out, and we're going to go to the meditation hall. And I sent out an invitation to whoever would like to join. And the wind was really strong and very angry. And some of the people from my retreat decided not to actually join. And one of the ladies stood on above the lake on the retreat center. She could see what was happening with the fires coming through. And there were professional firefighters and volunteers that had been doing a lot of work, and also a number of other nature communicators in the area who had already been working with the spirit of fire for a long time. So I can't say that what happened next necessarily was the turning point, but I'd like to think that it contributed to what happened. So we sat, and I guided everybody through a journey to meet the ancestors. And it took maybe 45 minutes. And right in the middle of that 45 minutes, everything went really quiet. We couldn't hear anything that was happening outside anymore, even though there were crazy winds and there was lots of shouting, and you can imagine like fires coming to the boundary of the property. And a lot of people got messages that were really profound, and I could see some of the ancestors on a psychic level. I could see these hunter-gatherer ancestors, and apparently this coastline is part of what is believed to be where humans evolved over the last 150, 200,000 years. So you can imagine that these are also our ancestors, modern day ancestors, that are walking these planes on other planes of existence, other realms. And we listened and we got messages, and something seemed to shift in the fields, energetic fields, but I couldn't tell what it was. So we went outside at the end of the journey, and the wind had changed. And inexplicably, the wind had changed direction, and suddenly the fire wasn't coming into Bodhikaya anymore. So it was just like driving along the edge of the border. And the fierceness, somebody had said amongst the firefighters, the fierceness had gone out of the fire. And everything shifted. And even though there wasn't any rain forecasted for that evening, rain started falling that night. And that really changed everything to do with the fire. And of course, there'd been a huge amount of ecosystem restoration work and replanting of indigenous plants in the area, which had helped to slow down the fire, which had really helped with, creating big fire breaks. There'd been a lot of work around that as well. So that probably, the firefighters are real heroes in that story. I'd like to think that what we did made some kind of a difference, and everybody seemed to notice it as well. And you can never tell exactly like what is real or not with that. All you can do is work with what you are shown. But this isn't the only story like it. Like a number of my colleagues have had experiences where they've seen fire literally stopping razor sharp line along the fence of their border. And I've seen this. There's a colleague of mine, dear friend and colleague in Greece, Eleni Gikaki, and she's the founder of Interspecies Peace. And I visited the place where she lives a few weeks after a fire had raged through her property a number of years ago. And I witnessed the same thing, this fire that had literally just stopped on the fence line, and there was no logical explanation for that. And so what that tells me is that Bodhikaya's founder and the staff and the caretakers for a long time have been invested in this concept of treating the land as custodians, as guardians of the land in a way that goes beyond the physical. So I know that I also have permission to share this story, I should say. So I'm allowed to speak about that in that way, but it's one of the few instances that I'm aware of where this has happened, where people in the area are really taking up their role as custodians, as guardians of a landscape, and acknowledging that the landscape is more than what we physically see. And I know that this is something that is widely practiced amongst many indigenous cultures worldwide, has been for millennia, and thankfully still is. And I witnessed this firsthand. I went to New Zealand, Aotearoa, for 6 weeks in February and March. And part of the reason why I went there was because as part of the work with Ecofluency, I do consulting and I do teaching, and I also do energetic clearing work for landscapes. And so that's kind of psychic surgery to remove the blockages towards spontaneous return to wholeness healing that would ordinarily happen. But sometimes there's just a little bit of help needed that the system cannot do on its own. So I was working with a couple who are regenerative beef and dairy farmers, and they had booked me to do a land clearing. And so part of that process, which took a number of months, was that I had to physically go to New Zealand, and I'd never been before. And we were asked to do pilgrimage with the nearest volcano to that farm. And the nearest volcano turns out to be Mount Ruapeu, which is the tallest volcano on the North Island. So when we went there when we went to visit the volcano and we made pilgrimage, we had a cultural induction by the indigenous caretakers of the area, which is something I would always do before going to anywhere that's considered to be a sacred space, is I find out who are the indigenous people of that area who would be who are willing and able to introduce me to that space. So when we went to the volcano, part of what we were doing is they do a karakia, which is kind of a greeting. And it's a way, it's not just an acknowledgement, but what I got to witness firsthand is that it is a nourishment as well to the landscape. And so we're standing on this volcano, and after they'd done the greeting, I could see on a psychic level, and I wasn't trying. It's very rare that my psychic vision just switches on like that. But I could witness that there were these rivers of lava that were flowing up into the volcano and back into it, not coming out. And I asked one of the one of the Maori elders who were there and wisdom keepers, what's that about? And he was surprised that I could see it. And one of the younger guys, Maori guys, who was standing there was like, "You're quite trippy, aren't you?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I guess so, but that's part of my work, is being able to witness this." And I said, "It looks to me like you're sending lava back in, but is that the goal?" And he said, "Not necessarily, but that is what the landscape needs." So what I gathered from that whole conversation is that the songs, the prayers, the blessings will nourish the invisible aspects and elements of the landscape, because they cannot do that easily on their own. And it's something that later in the trip, that whole work visit, I got to experience the landscape asking for more of that. That if the subterranean aspects of a landscape are not acknowledged and taken care of and nourished, then it actually does severely affect the landscape. And then you can have things like wildfires and floods and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that are more than what are necessary. And of course, fire can be very cleansing. It is transformative power. And sometimes fire will happen because things are out of balance. So to bring things into balance and in a way that avoids it being destructive, this is where we as humans can play a role, which is to be able to use, yes, our physical bodies to plant indigenous trees, to manage the landscape in a way that allows it to be a water retention landscape, to improve the biodiversity and the fertility of that landscape. And we forget that so much of what we need to be doing as humans actually is metaphysical. And this is where it becomes an energetic, a spiritual process as well, because we are actually married to the landscape in that way. And with any relationship, it needs nourishment, it needs communication, because communication is what engenders trust. It's what brings about I mean, we already are in this alchemical crucible of relationship with every aspect of nature all the time. We forget. But it's when we use communication that we can accelerate the evolutionary process and learning journey that happens in that relational space. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that if we remember, if we learn again what our ancestors knew, the relationship with nature, the communication of the needs of the nature, we can in fact live in peace with the nature, that there are no needs of cataclysms and all the, let's say, non-pleasure part of what nature sometimes does, but she does it maybe because she needs the healing. So, and the, I don't know, the eruption, the flood, the fires, it's probably the only way she can at the moment somehow help herself. Or do I understand it right? Can you explore on this?
Sure. Yeah. So what I understand
Mhm.
in my experience from working with more than human aspects of nature is that our presence is both needed and not needed.
Mhm.
Earth is going to be fine without us.
Yeah.
If we were to suddenly all die out, it's not the end of this world, it's the end of our world.
Mhm.
And our presence is nourishing if we know how to live in a way that is truly in harmony. And harmony doesn't mean that everything is all sweet and butterflies and birds and sunbeams. There's still going to be storms. The ocean still has like massive storms, and volcanoes were erupting long before humans. You can't say that volcanic eruptions are just because of the faults of
Yeah,
humans.
yeah, absolutely.
So what we can say, and climate has always been shifting.
Mhm.
Climate has always been changing. It's hubris to think that the entirety of climate change is due to us as humans. We have definitely contributed a lot to it. And also, there is a natural process that happens on this earth that is regardless
Mhm.
of human activity as well. However, if we were to change how we behave, we can have a bigger impact on this earth in a positive way than if we were absent.
Mhm.
And that starts by us, like you had already said, listening to what is needed. And this is what brilliant author and activist Andrew Harvey talks about as sacred activism. No, sorry, was that Richard Louv? Was it Andrew Harvey? I think it was Andrew
Andrew
Harvey.
Harvey definitely talks about that.
Yes, sorry, he coined that term. Yes,
Mhm. Mhm.
he coined the term, and all that means is being able to acknowledge the fact that there's action that can happen that takes place on a more than physical level. Like when you see the impact that the Heart Math Institute has measured worldwide, that being in global coherence, by using prayer, using strong intention, you can actually have a much bigger impact on this world than just working in the physical. So people can joke that like thoughts and prayers aren't enough. And yes, sometimes it's not enough. You do actually have to take physical action. And um, also, thoughts and prayers are needed. It's
Mhm.
both and rather than either or.
Mhm.
So when I think of myself as an activist, yes, there is physical activism I sometimes take part in, but the bulk of it is actually by being able to stand up and say things that many other people would be uncomfortable saying, for example. And when we talk about the things that are uncomfortable to us, when we acknowledge that actually there is real evil in this world. There are shadow aspects of ourselves that we need to deal with and integrate, rather than doing the spiritual bypassing thing of just thinking like, oh, just think positively, and you don't need that kind of negativity in your life. Like, there's a place and a time for that, but also one needs to face the truth of things, because it's only when we face what truly is happening that things can start to shift. And this is part of what activists do, is that they bring light to things that for a long time have been covered up. This is part of what feminism does, for example. It's not like suddenly now feminism is a new thing. It's actually always been present, but now thankfully it's gaining more traction. And it speaks to not just the rise of woman, but the feminine in both men and women, to find balance rather than swinging the pendulum from one direction to another. There's a dynamic balance in all humans that brings about true harmony, because harmony is true harmony, in my opinion, is the capacity to thrive where there isn't just calm. And I actually saw this recently online again, which is that true nervous regulation is not just about staying calm all the time. It's being able to be activated, which is a natural process, when something activates our nervous system, and we need to have our sympathetic nervous system activated and then return to a parasympathetic state. And it's that elasticity in ourselves that allows for homeostasis and allows for evolution in a way that is truly beneficial. That's where we become leaders within ourselves and within ecosystems, and within ecosystems that are not just what you do with the rest of nature, but ecosystems like schools, within political arenas, within organizations, within businesses, within family systems. That is really where we start to evolve and find balance between all parts of ourselves, from the inner child to the wise elder within ourselves. All of those parts are needed. And that starts by recognizing that there's also an activist within us. And activist, not just where it's about standing up and saying uncomfortable things, but being able, and this is actually also what an activist often needs to learn, is to rest, to step back and examine what's going on in oneself, because that is also needed in a world that really profits off our exhaustion. To take the time to truly rest and introspect is a form of activism, is a form of powerful evolution.
Do you think that kind of, because the reconnection with nature very often includes us to somehow get in touch or connect with our wildness, our unpredictability, or with, as you said, uncomfortable things within us? Do you think that that could be the part, because we are afraid very often of our wilderness, and it doesn't mean that wild, as you said, harmony is not just being all the time in the zen, because I think harmony is a very dynamic process, because the harmony is at every single moment of our life somewhere else. Do you think that the fear of being wild, and again, wild doesn't mean that we're gonna run through the field. We can be wild and sitting in absolutely cool, quiet state, is the reason why we are not in the full connection with nature, and could that change our relationship with nature?
Yeah, definitely. So when we think about what does wild mean, we, like you were saying, people often think of like an African savanna or deep dark forest with bears and wolves. And yes, there is that aspect to it. But sometimes entering into the wilderness actually means exploring the wilderness of our own psyche. And we were talking earlier on about like what does what's the difference between nature communication as a skill and nature communication as a way of relating to it. And I know that at one point, there was this question around observing the land versus entering into relationship with it as well. And when we observe landscape, whether it's wild landscapes outside or whether it's wild landscapes within us, that already is entering into relationship. Because in Western science, you have something called the observer effect, which is that simply observing a system already changes it. So actually, you can never have any true objectivity within science. It's just not possible. So and even if you're going to be using like double-blind studies, for example, there's always someone observing. So there's always going to be the observer effect in action. And so by bringing our attention to a place, whether it's an internal place, whether it's an external place, we're already entering into this, as I mentioned before, this alchemical tension of relationship, which both changes you and the landscape, your inner landscape and the external landscape, and as within, so without. So the moment one is going to be observing something internally, that's going to change something externally. The moment we observe something externally, it's going to shift something within us as well. And so when we're entering into a place of true observation, of acceptance of what truly is on the inside, and I've learned this from wilderness awareness and bushcraft and like survival outdoors. I've done courses in that as well, and I've learned from my teachers that when one comes to a place of balance and calm within oneself, the rest of the ecosystem around you adapts accordingly. And I've had this experience where in a wild environment, animals will behave very differently if your internal state is calm, is at peace. And it doesn't mean that you have to be like permanently at peace. You can find a temporary state of peace as well, of temporary harmony within yourself, where you feel like you remember that you are one with this external landscape. And then you witness elephants walking past, knowing that you're there, but also totally fine with the fact that you're there and also ignoring you. And even predators like lions walking past. Deer, who are very skittish, will go with their fawns through your camp and just be chill, because the fact is that they know that they recognize you as one of them. You might be a threat, you might be a predator, but you're in a state of calm. So the wilderness around you adapts. So there's so much I could say about this particular topic, but what I will say is that it has more to do with not our contact with nature, but the nature of that contact. Because so many people will go out on safari and they'll be present there, but maybe not fully present. They'll be on their phones or trying to get a shot on their camera and to record it, because, if you don't Instagram it, did it even happen? That kind of thing. And if you are even just going to a city park, if you're walking through your nearest forest, being fully present is actually what changes it, changes you. And that's been shown. I forget the name of is a Japanese researcher who recently published about this as well. I can't remember his name or the name of the study offhand, but this is something that has been shown, is that like on a biochemical level, your body changes when you are fully present in an external environment like a forest, because there are all these alkaloid mists that get released by the trees, these volatile compounds. You get microbed by the forest, and you become one with the forest in a way that shifts your nervous system and also expands one's worldview. And that can be on a very subtle level, but the more you do that, the more you are likely to have these long-term, larger changes that happen. And it's been shown that even just 3 days of camping out in the wilderness, and even not full wilderness, but just living outdoors and having a campfire in front of you, can dramatically, I'm talking like huge number of cancer cells die off naturally because you are in this environment. So entering into a wild state doesn't mean having to go and drop yourself like naked and afraid out in the middle of nowhere and be surrounded by predators and not knowing where you're going to eat and sleep, next. It's often more to do with an internal state. And because there are fewer and fewer places where we have, as modern humans, accessible, and a lot of those places are under threat. We see that in the US and in New Zealand, for example, these national parks, these places that have been set aside for conservation previously, are now under threat of being privatized and being developed rather than protected as accessible for us as modern humans who need to have those spaces for our benefit, but also obviously for the rest of nature. For us to be able to evolve by being immersed in those spaces. And if you can't have access to those, if you're living in a city, then being able to traverse the internal landscape becomes more important as well. Being able to have physical contact with a tree in a park and be fully present with that tree is both possible and crucially important in the modern world. Yeah.
Yeah. That reminded me, you mentioned about the metaphysical part of your work. And what I observe very often is that people kind of love to work with the psychic stuff and the metaphysical realms, and all the channeling, and doing Om and Zen and all the stuff. But they very often forget to take the body with them, to take the nature with them. What is your experience with integrating both? What helps us remain in balance?
It's a good question. And I often think of embodiment not just as a luxury that we can have, but actually as critically important in everyday modern life, but also in nature communication. And of course, I want to preface this by saying that I'm fully aware that a lot of people hold a lot of trauma in their bodies. In fact, probably, I put money
Most
on
of
it to
us.
say that almost every single person in this world holds an enormous amount of trauma in their physical body. So it's not to say that we have to, automatically just drop into our bodies and trust everything in the wisdom of the body. I think it's a process in the same way that rekindling our ancestral capacity to communicate with nature is our birthright, our responsibility, our duty to do. The same is going to be true for reclaiming this landscape of the body. Because the body as a listening instrument is so powerful. When we're listening with our clairvoyance or our clairaudience, this telepathic paranormal capacities that we have, which are actually perfectly ordinary everyday magic that we've forgotten.
Yeah.
When we start activating not just the wisdom of the heart and opening the mind, but we recognize that there's the wisdom of the gut, there's the wisdom of the womb, the wisdom of the skin, all of these other parts of ourselves, means that we can listen with more of ourselves, because there are as many ways to communicate with nature as there are people alive today and more. So there are going to be a whole variety of ways in which humans can tune in and listen and dialogue with the more than human. I mentioned singing, dancing. Those are very powerful ways. Music as very powerful ways of communicating with nature. And so when we are activating that, we have to activate the body. I don't know anybody who can dance without being aware of their physical body. And of course, there are many people who feel like they need to dissociate slightly as a survival mechanism, which is fully understandable, and that's perfectly natural. And we need to be careful about normalizing that, because when we step outside of the room, so to say, it means that there's now a vacancy in our energetic field, and that can make us vulnerable to the trespass of certain energies or entities that come in and can cause mental and physical problems. And I see this on a very regular basis, because so much of my work is to do with energetic field clearings and psychic surgery. So removing those from the physical from the energetic field often clears things up on a physical level as well. But even just on an everyday level, something that is accessible to all of us is our breath, is to be able to move in very gentle, slow ways. One doesn't have to be going into hugely cathartic experiences where it's screaming and like wild dancing. Like, yes, that's amazing and fun for many people. And sometimes actually gentle, slow is really necessary. Like, not all of us can go into extreme cold plunges, especially if you've got like a hypersensitive nervous system. And especially for women, that's just unwise. And I know that from myself. Like, I've experienced the dangers of actually overactivating my nervous system and then having involuntary shuddering of my whole body for 24 hours that I couldn't stop because of trying to do pushing the body beyond its limits in a way that was out of alignment for what was needed for my nervous system. So
Sometimes we learn the hard way, right?
sometimes we do learn the hard way, and there's absolutely a space and time to push the body beyond its limits because that's how muscles grow as well, right? You have to tear them in order for them to grow. And where there's no pain, there's no gain sometimes. So
Yes.
that's going to be true. And there's also a need to recognize that there's no blanket approach for everybody. So when I teach in eco-fluency, the foundational steps, I'm teaching people right from the start that this is a path that needs to be taken at one's own pace, that it needs to be nervous system friendly. It needs to be done in a way that you are managing as much as possible the process, because it is going to push your buttons. It is going to challenge your worldviews, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And you're going to have ontological shocks. You know, your perception of reality is going to be shaken on a foundational level. And that's important and that's good. So looking after oneself in the process becomes even more important. And that starts with recognizing how do we awaken our physical senses, become more aware of the breath, use the tools that we have available, which, I mean, it's all over social media, it's all over the internet. Use very basic tools. There's some practices, free exercises on the Ecofluency website. If people would like to come into the wisdom of the body in a very gentle, careful way, as the first step, because this is how we listen to the rest of nature. If this is nature itself, and it is, spoiler alert, then it means that nature communication starts very often for many people by listening to ourselves, listening with ourselves then as well. So it's not just listening to ourselves, it's listening with ourselves and more of ourselves, which is not just mind to mind, heart to heart, which is what so many nature communicators will talk about as being what it is. It is that, and it is more. So my goal with Ecofluency is to expand the definition of what nature communication is, to expand the definition of nature, and to make it more widely accessible to a much larger portion of the world's population, which means that it has to be adaptable to all kinds of demographics, all kinds of cultures, all kinds of belief systems, nervous system states, you know, it's all going to be necessary in this goal that I have to make nature communication a household concept and practice worldwide.
I love that. I love that. Saskia, you already mentioned that in the beginning, talking about communicating with the land. You often speak about land intelligence. Can you more explore or go deeply about what land intelligence is?
I quite literally mean that the landscape has intelligence. Okay, so animals, trees, microbes, mountains, rivers, various other physical aspects of a landscape, we can all call them guardians of a landscape, right? And they each hold these different responsibilities. So, for example, here in South Africa, elephants are not just ecosystem engineers. You know, they push over trees, they actively manage the architecture of a forest or a savanna. And of course, that would classify them as a guardian of a landscape. But it is the sounds that they carry and share along their migratory pathways, which in South Africa is very, very limited compared to historically. Those sounds, their presence their physical presence and their energetic presence and the sounds that they make, they reconfigure the spaces that they pass through on a metaphysical level. So they're updating the so-called evolutionary software for the hardware of the ecosystem, of the landscape. And so in many maps, it is these beings and also the beings who exist beyond the physical realm who are primarily responsible for looking after the operational vitality of the manifest realm. And I've alluded to these previously when I talk about these invisible aspects of nature. But it's these invisible guardians who you could say include human ancestors, but actually there's a much wider range of more than human elements of landscapes, of nature, who hold greater power in forming landscapes and increasing biodiversity and guiding ecosystems to prosperity. And it's these interdimensional species who support ecosystems at all scales, whether it's from the internal terrain of our digestive systems and our gut microbiome to the regional geography of a country, for example, or to the many planetary systems who orbit our sun and beyond to the entire galaxy. So, and of course, we need to recognize that there's going to be differences in the language preferences for what we call these intangible forces, both within and across various cultures. So, for example, these elements could go by many names. Some will call them guardian spirits, some will call them overarching intelligences, some will call them overlighting angels, or genius loci, as it's described in anthroposophy, or devas, as it's described in Sanskrit and in those languages that evolved from Sanskrit, like Hindi. Guiding essences is another word that could be used to describe them. So there are many different names for these beings, and they're recognized in every single spiritual tradition and indigenous culture that I'm aware of worldwide. And so when we deepen our relationship with these landscape intelligences, this is part of how we enter into or reclaim our role as a keystone species once again. And I don't think I mentioned it beforehand, but a keystone species is a species that can do things that no other species can.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, an elephant will be able to push down trees that no other animal can do. Humans can do ritual and ceremony and singing and dancing in a way that no other species can do. And all of these fulfill a particular role and are all crucial in the well-being of that ecosystem, both, on an individual level, but for planetary well-being. Yeah, so that's what I mean when I talk about landscape intelligence.
Fantastic. It's beautiful. If we as a humans could hear the land, if we remember again and could hear the land, what the land would tell us in order to be able to entering into deeper relationship, into better relationship, to hear the land again.
In my experience, the biggest challenge to rekindling this dormant ability is believing in certainty.
Mm-hmm.
So an example of this could be that you think you have a handle on the architecture of reality. And I say this because I speak from experience. Or believing that a particular disease is incurable.
Mm-hmm.
That you can't change something that Western science has said it can't change. And I know this for myself. I've had experiences with clients who I've worked with where they've physically undergone changes that there's no explanation in Western science, from scoliosis starting to reverse to fertility issues clearing up spontaneously to the shape of certain organs changing and previous issues just miraculously disappearing. And another belief in uncertainty or holding on to a certainty is that some people are like, there's no way that you can communicate with nature like this. And I'm like, yeah, maybe not for you because you don't believe in whimsy. And it's like, I've had experiences of entering into this magic realities. And I know that our certainties allow us to stay grounded and to feel safe, but they also hold us back from our evolution if we stick to them in a stubborn way. So our imagination really is the limit. And I've seen miraculous things change in landscapes. And this this happens when we stay curious rather than certain about what is possible. So when the landscape is asking us, what the landscape is asking from us right now is to believe that more is possible, is to believe in magic.
Mm-hmm.
I did a podcast interview yesterday, and one of the things that came up in it was right at the end, the podcast host asked, what message does nature have for us? And I'll share that here today because it's just as relevant. Because I listened, I was like, what message do you guys want to share? And it was to remember that we are love itself.
Mm-hmm.
To remember who we are, which is love itself. And to remember that one of our main purposes on this earth is to love and to be loved. And that includes the landscape, because we forget we are the landscape itself. We are an extension of the earth. And it's only in loving the land in that way, like caressing the earth, like it's a very dear friend, like it's your mother, because it is. She is your mother. Only by doing that we start to shift our relationship with ourselves and with the rest of nature.
Thank you very much for time you gave us and the wisdom you shared.
Thank you so much for letting me speak about this here and for the space that you provide for others to talk about this. It's very necessary that we share the message of nature communication in any form. So thank you.
Thank you.